the quiet form of loneliness. This channel is for women who are doing fine but feel quietly lost. I want to start here, before explanations, before theories, before anyone tries to fix anything. Because if that sentence landed somewhere uncomfortable inside you, then you already know what I'm about to talk about. You didn't need a definition, you didn't need statistics, you felt recognition. A small, quiet recognition that didn't explode but settled. That's how female loneliness usually arrives. Not as a breakdown, not as a crisis, not as a moment where life visibly falls apart. It arrives disguised as competence. I didn't wake up one day and think, I am lonely. I woke up and thought, I am tired, without knowing what I was tired of. I went through my routines with precision. I showed up, I followed through. I kept my life moving forward in ways that looked responsible, even admirable, from the outside. Nothing was technically wrong, and that's what made it so hard to name. I wasn't isolated in the obvious sense. I spoke to people every day. I had conversations, meetings, obligations, exchanges that fill the hours. I knew how to smile at the right moments. I knew how to keep things light. I knew how to reassure others that I was fine. I had mastered the art of being fine. But somewhere along the way, my inner life went quiet, not peaceful, not calm, just muted. Like a room where the soundproofing is too good. Nothing echoes back. Loneliness, the kind women like me experience, doesn't scream. It whispers. And because it whispers, it's easy to ignore for years. It shows up as a vague restlessness I can't explain, as a sense that time is passing without meaning sticking to it, as evenings that feel longer than they should, even when they're full, as laughter that fades too quickly after it happens. It shows up as a strange emotional neutrality. I'm not devastated, I'm not joyful, I'm just here, floating somewhere between gratitude and grief, without fully belonging to either. I remember standing alone in my kitchen one night, the city outside humming softly, the refrigerator light casting a pale glow across the floor. I wasn't crying, I wasn't upset, I wasn't even sad in the way sadness is usually portrayed. I just felt absent from my own life. That moment scared me more than any dramatic breakdown ever could have. Because when something is obviously broken, you're allowed to respond. You're allowed to ask for help. You're allowed to say, I'm not okay. But when nothing looks wrong, when you're functioning, productive, stable, you're expected to keep going. And so you do. Female loneliness thrives in that expectation. We live in a culture that praises women for endurance, for adaptability, for emotional intelligence, for being able to carry weight quietly. And over time, that praise turns into a trap, because the more capable I appear, the less anyone imagines I might be struggling. And the less they imagine it, the less they ask. Eventually, they stop asking altogether. And eventually, so do I. I stopped checking in with myself in any honest way. I learned how to manage discomfort instead of listening to it. I told myself I was lucky. I told myself others had it worse. I told myself this was just adulthood, just maturity, just the price of being responsible. But loneliness doesn't go away just because you explain it away. It waits. It waits in the background of busy lives, in the space between conversations, in the moments right before sleep when there's nothing left to perform for. It waits patiently because it knows eventually everything else will quiet down. And then it speaks, not with panic, with a question. Is this it? That question isn't dramatic. It doesn't come with urgency. It comes with a dull ache, like pressure behind the eyes, like something unfinished, like a life that is technically full but emotionally undernourished. This is the kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being unseen, from realizing that most of your interactions skim the surface of who you are, that people know your roles but not your inner landscape, that they see what you produce, what you contribute, what you manage, but not what you carry. And if I'm honest, part of that is my fault. I learned early how to be low maintenance, how to not take up too much space, how to be the woman who is easy to be around, the woman who listens, the woman who understands, the woman who doesn't need much. I didn't become that woman because I was weak. I became her because she was rewarded. She was trusted, she was relied on, she was admired, but she was also alone. There is a specific loneliness that comes from being the strong one, the capable one, the emotionally steady one. When you become that person, people stop imagining that you might need care too. And when they stop imagining it, they stop offering it. After a while, you stop expecting it. And that's when loneliness becomes internalized. It stops being about other people and starts being about your relationship with yourself, about how much of yourself you've hidden, not because anyone asked you to, but because it seemed easier. I didn't feel lonely because I lacked relationships. I felt lonely because I lacked resonance, depth, mutual emotional presence. I could sit across from someone who genuinely cared about me and still feel completely alone because nothing we talked about touched the truth of my inner life. We talked about schedules, responsibilities, plans, safe topics, the weather of our lives, not the climate. And every time I said, I'm fine, when I wasn't, a small part of me disappeared. That's the quiet erosion no one talks about. Female loneliness doesn't always look like despair. Often, it looks like emotional minimalism. Like learning to want less, expect less, feel less, so that disappointment hurts less too. But numbness isn't peace, and functioning isn't fulfillment. The most unsettling part of this kind of loneliness is that it can coexist with a life that looks successful. You can have stability, independence, intelligence, and still feel like something essential is missing. And when you try to name that absence, the world doesn't always give you language for it. Instead, it gives you slogans. Be grateful. Be strong. Be independent. Be resilient. All useful qualities. None of them cures loneliness, because loneliness isn't a failure of strength. It's a signal of disconnection. From others, yes, but also from yourself. I didn't lose myself in one dramatic moment. I lost myself slowly, by prioritizing what was expected over what was true, by choosing composure over honesty, by mistaking emotional self-sufficiency for wholeness. And the world applauded me for it. That's why female loneliness is so hard to see. It's hidden inside lives that appear together. Inside women who are doing everything right, inside routines that leave no visible cracks. But inside those lives, there is often a quiet question echoing unanswered. When did I stop feeling like I belonged to my own life? If you're still listening right now, I want to pause and say this clearly. You are not strange for feeling this way. You are not ungrateful. You are not broken. You are responding normally to a life that asks you to give more than it allows you to receive. And if this conversation already feels like someone finally named something you've been carrying silently, then I invite you to stay. If this channel speaks to you, if these words feel like they're sitting beside you rather than talking at you, please consider subscribing. Not for motivation, not for answers, but for companionship, for reflection, for the quiet understanding that you're not the only one standing in this in-between space. Your subscription tells me this kind of conversation matters. And it gives this channel the space to keep telling stories that don't shout, but stay. Because this isn't about fixing anything. It's about finally telling the truth out loud. Aloneness is not loneliness. I used to believe that being alone was the problem. That if I could just fill the empty hours with more people, more conversations, more plans, the discomfort would dissolve on its own. I blamed the silence of my apartment. I blamed the evenings that stretched too long. I blamed the fact that there was no one sitting across from me at the end of the day, asking how I really was. But that explanation never fully satisfied me because it didn't account for the moments when I was surrounded by people and still felt completely detached from myself. It didn't explain why I could leave a dinner, a meeting, even a family gathering, and feel more isolated than when I arrived. That's when I began to understand something uncomfortable, but clarifying. Aloneness and loneliness are not the same thing. In fact, they often get mistaken for each other in ways that do real emotional damage. Aloneness is a physical condition. Loneliness is an emotional one. And confusing the two can keep a woman running in the wrong direction for years. There are moments when being alone feels like relief, when the absence of noise allows something inside me to breathe, when I don't have to perform coherence or manage anyone else's expectations, when I can move slowly, think freely, exist without explanation. That state isn't empty. It's spacious. It's quiet in a way that feels earned. That is aloneness. Loneliness feels nothing like that. Loneliness feels crowded, heavy, constricting. It can exist in a packed room, in a marriage, in a long-standing friendship. It's the feeling of being emotionally unreachable, even when someone is sitting inches away. It's the sense that whatever matters most inside me has no place to land in the world I'm currently inhabiting. I didn't understand this distinction for a long time, because the culture I live in doesn't make it easy to see. We're taught to treat solitude as something suspicious, something to escape from. If a woman spends too much time alone, people assume something must be wrong, that she's lonely, that she's failing socially, that she hasn't been chosen. So when discomfort surfaced during my alone time, I panicked. I assumed the discomfort itself was proof that something needed fixing, that I needed to add people, add noise, add connection quickly before the feeling deepened into something irreversible. But loneliness doesn't respond to noise. It responds to presence. And presence is something no one else can supply on my behalf. I started noticing how I actually spent my time alone. Not how I described it, but how I lived it. Hours dissolved into screens, evenings blurred into distraction, silence filled with background noise, so I wouldn't have to sit too closely with my own thoughts. I wasn't choosing solitude. I was avoiding myself. That's an uncomfortable realization. because it strips away the convenient story that loneliness is something other people cause. It suggests that part of the disconnection happens internally, long before it shows up in relationships. Loneliness, in that sense, isn't always a lack of companionship. Sometimes it's a lack of self-contact. There is a particular kind of emotional abandonment that happens when a woman learns to override her own signals, when she stays busy enough not to feel, when she keeps herself stimulated enough not to listen, when she treats rest, reflection, and stillness as indulgences rather than necessities. Over time, that internal distance becomes normal. You forget what it feels like to be fully present with yourself. And when you lose that capacity, no amount of social interaction can compensate for it. I've had conversations that were technically warm, technically supportive, technically intimate, and still walked away feeling unseen because the issue wasn't the other person's effort. It was that I had learned to offer a curated version of myself. One that didn't require much engagement in return. Loneliness thrives in that dynamic, not because people don't care, but because the exchange never reaches depth, because the real self stays hidden, even from the woman who carries it. Aloneness, when it's embraced rather than avoided, does the opposite. It strips away the performance. It exposes the habits I use to keep myself occupied. It shows me how uncomfortable I've become with simply being. And yes, that exposure can be unsettling at first. There's a moment when the distractions fall away and all that's left is me, my restlessness, my unresolved questions, my unspoken grief. That moment can feel like loneliness if I misinterpret it, but it isn't. It's contact. Loneliness doesn't come from sitting alone with myself. It comes from refusing to stay there long enough to listen. I began to notice that the women I admired most weren't the ones who filled every moment with activity or attention. They were the ones who seemed at home in their own presence, who could sit quietly without rushing to justify it, who didn't treat solitude as something to escape from, but as something to return to. That kind of aloneness isn't empty, it's anchored, and it creates a very different relationship with connection. When I'm grounded in myself, I don't seek people to fill a void. I seek them to share a fullness. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Loneliness makes relationships feel urgent. Aloneness makes them feel intentional. When I'm lonely, I'm tempted to accept any connection that dulls the feeling, even if it doesn't nourish me. I tolerate shallow exchanges. I stay in environments that don't resonate. I mistake proximity for intimacy because it's easier than facing the deeper discomfort of being with myself. When I'm at ease with aloneness, I become more selective, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. I recognize when something doesn't align. I notice when conversation stays at the surface. I stop forcing myself to belong in places where I feel unseen. That clarity can feel isolating at first, especially in a world that equates busyness with belonging. But it's a cleaner kind of solitude, one that doesn't drain me, one that actually makes space for genuine connection to enter when it arrives. There's another layer to this distinction that took me even longer to understand. Loneliness often comes from outsourcing my inner life, from expecting other people to mirror me back to myself, to validate my feelings, to give shape and meaning to my experience. When that reflection doesn't come, I feel abandoned. Aloneness, on the other hand, is what allows me to reclaim that responsibility, not in a self-sufficient, hardened way, but in a grounded one. It's the understanding that I don't need to be constantly witnessed in order to exist fully. That doesn't mean I don't want connection. It means I no longer confuse connection with rescue. Loneliness feels like waiting to be found. Aloneness feels like arriving. And perhaps the most difficult truth is this. Many women fear aloneness because it forces an honest encounter with their own lives, with choices made and not made, with desires deferred, with versions of themselves that were set aside in the name of practicality or survival. Loneliness can be numbed. Aloneness cannot be distracted from forever. But that honesty is not punishment, it's orientation. When I allow myself to be alone without trying to fix the feeling, I start to notice what actually nourishes me. Not what looks good, not what fills time, not what distracts. What genuinely brings me back into alignment with myself. And from that place, loneliness loses some of its power. It doesn't disappear entirely, but it no longer defines me because I am no longer confusing silence with emptiness. I am no longer treating my own presence as insufficient. I am learning slowly, imperfectly, that aloneness is not a problem to solve. It's a relationship to tend, and when that relationship is intact, loneliness becomes a signal rather than a sentence. A signal that something needs attention. Not more noise, not more people, but more truth. The invisible pressure on women. There is a kind of pressure that never announces itself. It doesn't arrive as a command. It doesn't come with deadlines or warnings. It doesn't raise its voice. Instead, it settles quietly into the background of my life and reshapes my posture from the inside. It teaches me how to hold myself, how to speak, how much of myself is acceptable to show. I didn't notice it at first because it felt normal. That's the most dangerous thing about invisible pressure. It disguises itself as common sense. I learned early what was expected of me, not through explicit rules, but through patterns, through who was praised and who was corrected, through what earned approval and what earned discomfort. I learned that being capable was good, being reliable was good, being emotionally aware but not emotionally demanding was very good. I learned that my value increased the more I could handle without complaint. No one ever set me down and said, "You must become this way." It was subtler than that. It was in the way people relaxed when I said I was fine. In the way conversations moved more smoothly when I didn't complicate them with truth. In the way my strength made other people comfortable. And so I became strong. But strength, when it's unexamined, can turn into a cage. As a woman living in the middle of life, I exist between narratives that don't quite fit. I was raised with the echoes of older expectations. Be nurturing, be accommodating, be gracious, and handed a modern script that says I should also be independent, accomplished, and self-sufficient. I'm told I can have it all, but rarely told what happens when all of it starts asking for me at once. There is no ceremony for this transition, no acknowledgement that living at the intersection of these demands requires constant internal negotiation. I am expected to work with intensity but not let it define me, to care deeply but not lose myself, to age gracefully without appearing to age at all, to be emotionally literate but not emotionally inconvenient, to be flexible without becoming invisible. This pressure doesn't crush me in one moment. It wears me down through repetition. Every day, I make hundreds of small adjustments. I soften my language. I anticipate reactions. I edit myself before I speak. I choose which truths are worth the energy they'll require to explain. Most of this happens automatically now. That's how I know it's been going on for a long time. The invisible pressure on women is not just about doing more, it's about holding more. Emotional weight, social tension, unspoken responsibility. I carry it into meetings, into relationships, into rooms where my role is already assumed before I open my mouth. There are moments, quiet ones, when I catch myself holding my breath. Not because I'm anxious, but because I've learned to brace, to stay alert, to be ready to respond, adjust, absorb. This constant readiness is exhausting in ways that don't register as fatigue. It doesn't always feel like stress. It feels like vigilance. And vigilance isolates. I think about the emotional labor I perform without realizing it. Remembering who needs reassurance, monitoring the tone of conversations, smoothing over discomfort before it turns into conflict, making sure everyone else feels seen, included, understood. This labor rarely gets named, let alone reciprocated. When I do it well, it disappears. When I stop doing it, it becomes noticeable immediately. That imbalance creates a specific kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being central and still unseen, of being essential and still unacknowledged, of being needed but not known. I've noticed that when women express exhaustion, it's often interpreted as weakness rather than overload, as if fatigue indicates personal failure instead of systemic imbalance. So I learned to translate my tiredness into acceptable language. I say I'm busy. I say I'm juggling a lot. I say I just need a break. I don't say what I really mean. I mean that I'm tired of being the one who holds everything together without being held in return. In professional spaces, this pressure wears a different mask. I am expected to be competent without being intimidating, assertive without being abrasive, confident without being threatening, collaborative without disappearing. It's a narrow line to walk, and I walk it every day. In one meeting, my ideas are praised. In another, they are ignored until someone else repeats them. I notice the patterns, but I rarely name them. Naming them requires energy I don't always have, so I adapt instead. I learn when to speak and when to wait, when to push and when to yield, when to let something go for the sake of harmony. This adaptability keeps things running smoothly, but it also teaches me that my inner experience is secondary to the system functioning properly. That lesson follows me home. I bring it into my personal life, where it continues to operate quietly. I listen carefully, I ask questions, I support, I show up. And over time, I realize that very few people ask the same of me, not because they don't care, but because I've trained them not to worry. This is how invisible pressure becomes internalized. I stop expecting reciprocity. I stop articulating my needs. I stop trusting that my inner world matters enough to disrupt the flow of things. And then loneliness sets in not as a dramatic absence, but as a gradual thinning of connection. There's also grief embedded in this pressure. Grief for the versions of myself that didn't survive the adaptation, for the parts that were too inconvenient, too emotional, too slow, too uncertain. I didn't exile them intentionally. I simply stopped inviting them forward. The pressure to be together leaves little room for ambiguity, for confusion, for being unfinished. And yet, the middle of life is full of unfinished things, unanswered questions, shifting identities, relationships that no longer fit their original shape, dreams that changed quietly, without permission. There is no cultural language for this liminal space, so women carry it silently. We are expected to be grateful for what we have achieved, even when it no longer aligns with who we are becoming. We are expected to maintain stability, even when our inner landscapes are changing. We are expected to be emotionally mature enough not to need reassurance, not to need validation, not to need care. That expectation creates a loneliness that is difficult to articulate because it lives at the intersection of success and dissatisfaction. I hesitate to speak about it openly because I know how it sounds. I know how quickly it can be dismissed as entitlement, as ingratitude, as a lack of perspective. So I keep it contained. I learn how to narrate my life in acceptable terms. I say I'm busy. I say things are fine. I say I'm lucky. All true and all incomplete. The invisible pressure on women isn't just about performance. It's about containment, about learning how to hold complex emotional realities without leaking them into the world. But emotions don't disappear when they're contained. They turn inward. They deepen. They become loneliness. I don't feel lonely because I lack people. I feel lonely because the version of myself that navigates the world each day is only a partial translation of who I actually am. There is a cost to that translation. It's subtle at first. A dulling of curiosity, a quiet withdrawal from intimacy, a sense that my inner life is happening off stage while the public version of me continues to perform. Over time, that split becomes harder to sustain. I notice it when I can no longer answer simple questions honestly. When someone asks how I'm doing and I pause, not because I don't know, but because the real answer feels too large for the space it's been given. The invisible pressure teaches me to compress myself. Loneliness is the compression. This isn't about blaming individuals or rejecting responsibility. It's about recognizing the cumulative effect of living in a world that asks women to be everything while needing nothing. That equation doesn't balance. And when it doesn't, the imbalance shows up internally first, as distance, as quiet resentment, as a sense of being emotionally overdrawn. I don't need more praise for being strong. I don't need to be told I'm resilient. I need space to be unfinished, to be uncertain without apologizing, to be tired without explaining, to be human without translating my experience into something more palatable. The invisible pressure on women thrives on silence. It grows when it's unnamed, and loneliness is often the first sign that something essential has been ignored for too long. Not because I've failed, but because I've been carrying more than anyone was ever meant to carry alone. Modern connections, deeper isolation. There was a time when I believed connection was something I simply hadn't accessed correctly yet. That if I adjusted my approach, changed my tone, widened my circle, learned the language of modern intimacy, I would eventually arrive at the kind of closeness everyone else seemed to have figured out. I no longer believe that. What I see now is not a lack of opportunity to connect, but a surplus of contact without depth. A world saturated with interaction that rarely slows down long enough for anything meaningful to take root. I am connected all the time. My phone vibrates, my inbox fills, messages arrive and get answered. I know what people ate for dinner, where they traveled, how they feel about the latest news cycle. I know who got engaged, who is training for a marathon, who reinvented themselves again this year. And yet, very little of this feels like being in relationship. There is a strange emotional flatness that comes from this kind of constant exposure. Not boredom, overstimulation. Not emptiness, fragmentation. My attention is pulled in dozens of directions, and my emotional life never quite catches up. Modern connection has taught me to be responsive, not present. I reply quickly. I acknowledge. I react. I keep pace. But nothing lingers. Conversations rarely deepen. Moments don't have time to unfold before they're replaced by the next update, the next notification, the next small demand on my awareness. This constant, low-level engagement creates the illusion of intimacy. It feels like participation. It feels like inclusion. But it rarely reaches the place where loneliness actually lives. Loneliness doesn't come from being uninformed about others. It comes from being emotionally untouched. I've noticed that the more connected I appear on the surface, the less connected I often feel underneath. There is a saturation point where knowing more about people's lives doesn't translate into feeling closer to them. It simply creates more noise to filter through. And filtering is exhausting. Social media, in particular, has reshaped how I experience comparison not as envy, but as quiet displacement. I don't look at other women's lives and think I want what they have. I look and think everyone else seems to be somewhere I am not. The comparison isn't about achievement. It's about belonging. Everyone appears embedded in something: families, partnerships, communities, shared histories. Even when those things are imperfect, they create a sense of anchoring, a sense that life is happening within a container. My loneliness sharpens when I feel uncontained. This isn't because I lack relationships. It's because many of my connections exist without continuity. They start easily. They fade quietly. They require constant maintenance but offer little grounding in return. Modern dating reflects this pattern most clearly. It has never been easier to meet someone, and never harder to feel chosen. The language of dating has become transactional, optimized, efficient. Profiles replace presence. First impressions carry disproportionate weight. Conversations are evaluated quickly for entertainment value rather than emotional resonance. I've shared space with people who knew my preferences but not my fears, who touched my body but never asked about my inner life, who were available in moments but absent in continuity. These encounters aren't inherently harmful, but they are incomplete. Casual intimacy promises relief from loneliness, but often delivers only temporary distraction. It fills an evening without filling the deeper need to be known over time. And when it ends as it usually does, it leaves behind a sharper awareness of absence. Not heartbreak, absence. There is a specific grief that comes from connection without commitment, from closeness that doesn't stay, from moments that feel meaningful but aren't allowed to become real. I don't feel lonely because I haven't been touched. I feel lonely because I haven't been held emotionally in a way that lasts. And this pattern doesn't exist only in dating. It exists in friendships that orbit but never settle, in work relationships that rely on my competence but never inquire about my interior life, in social environments where I am welcomed but not anchored. Modern connection prioritizes access over attachment. I can reach people instantly. I can communicate across distances. I can be in touch without being in relationship. But when everything is accessible, nothing is rare. And when nothing is rare, depth loses its urgency. I've started to notice how often conversations stay safely above the surface. We exchange updates instead of experiences, opinions instead of emotions, narratives instead of truths. It's not that people don't want depth, it's that the structure of modern life doesn't make room for it. We are busy, fragmented, tired, conditioned to keep things moving. Slowness feels indulgent, silence feels awkward. Emotional pauses feel inefficient. So we skim, and skimming creates loneliness. I've also noticed how modern connection encourages performance. Even vulnerability has become curated. Confessions are packaged. Pain is aestheticized. Struggle is shared only once it has been processed, resolved, and reframed into something palatable. There is very little room for being unfinished. When I try to speak from the middle of something confused, uncertain, unresolved, I often sense discomfort, not hostility, discomfort, as if my honesty interrupts the rhythm everyone else is trying to maintain. So I learn to edit. I offer reflections instead of rawness, insight instead of confusion, closure instead of questions. This makes me easier to engage with. It also makes me lonelier. There is another layer to modern isolation that feels particularly sharp for women in midlife. I can be independent and still crave interdependence. I can be capable and still want support. I can value my autonomy and still ache for shared meaning. But modern narratives don't hold this complexity well. I'm told independence should be enough, that needing others is regression, that wanting partnership, community, or sustained intimacy somehow undermines my strength. So I internalize the message. I minimize my longing. I reframe my desires. I tell myself I don't need what I quietly miss. And loneliness grows not from lack, but from denial. I also see how technology has changed the way we end things. Connections don't dissolve through conversation anymore. They fade. Messages go unanswered. Invitations stop coming. Relationships disappear without closure. This ambiguity leaves emotional residue. I don't always know what ended or why. I'm left to fill in the gaps myself, to assume disinterest, to normalize disappearance. That normalization is isolating. It teaches me not to expect explanation, not to ask questions, not to need clarity. And clarity is one of the things that makes connection feel safe. Without it, I remain guarded. Modern connection has also blurred the boundaries between presence and absence. Someone can be constantly visible online and completely unavailable emotionally. They can watch my life unfold without ever stepping into it. This one-sided visibility creates a strange imbalance. I feel seen but not met, observed but not accompanied, and companionship without participation feels hollow. I'm not nostalgic for a past I didn't live in. I'm not arguing for simpler times or idealized versions of connection. I'm simply noticing that something essential has been lost in the acceleration. Connection requires friction, time, risk, repetition. Loneliness thrives when everything becomes optional and disposable. When relationships are easily exited, they're rarely entered fully. I don't think people are more selfish now. I think they are more overwhelmed, more cautious, more afraid of commitment, emotional, relational, existential, and fear creates distance. So we keep each other at arm's length. We interact without entangling. We touch without anchoring. We share without staying. From the outside, it looks like abundance. From the inside, it feels like drift. The deeper isolation of modern connection isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself as loss. It shows up as disorientation, as a sense that life is happening alongside me instead of with me. I don't feel rejected. I feel unmoored. And perhaps the hardest part is that this loneliness doesn't respond to effort in the way we're taught it should. I can socialize more, date more, engage more, and still feel the same quiet distance. Because the problem isn't access, it's attunement. Until connection allows for slowness, for unfinished truth, for sustained presence, it will continue to leave people like me feeling surrounded but alone. Not because we failed to connect, but because connection, as it currently exists, rarely asks us to arrive fully as ourselves. And without that arrival, loneliness doesn't end. It simply becomes more sophisticated. Women who don't belong anywhere. There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone and doesn't come from being unseen in a crowd. It comes from something quieter, more disorienting. It comes from realizing that no place truly feels like home anymore, not because every place is hostile, but because none of them quite fit. I didn't notice it at first. It revealed itself slowly through small moments that felt insignificant on their own. A pause before answering a familiar question. A feeling of being slightly out of sync in rooms I'd been in for years. The sense that I was always translating myself, softening edges, editing thoughts, adjusting tone no matter where I was. I would sit at a table surrounded by people who knew my name, my history, my role in their lives, and still feel like I was visiting, like my presence was correct but incomplete, like I belonged to the setting but not to the moment. This kind of loneliness doesn't ask, why am I alone? It asks, where do I actually belong? I've felt it in family spaces, where love is assumed rather than expressed, where conversations circle familiar ground and never venture into unfamiliar truth, where no one is unkind, but no one is curious either. I sit there, listening to stories I already know, watching dynamics repeat themselves exactly as they always have, and I feel strangely untethered, not rejected, not unloved, just unlocated. It's unsettling to realize that a place can hold your history without holding your present self, that people can love who you were, who you used to be, or who they believe you are, while missing who you've quietly become. In those moments, I feel like a guest in my own life, and leaving doesn't feel like an option, because leaving suggests drama, conflict, a declaration that something is wrong, but nothing is wrong enough to justify departure. Everything is polite, functional, acceptable. So I stay, and loneliness deepens, not because I am mistreated, but because I am mismatched. I've felt this same displacement in professional environments. Rooms where my competence is valued, but my interior life is irrelevant. Where I am respected, included, even admired, but only for the parts of me that are useful, the parts that produce, the parts that perform, the parts that don't ask to be known beyond what they offer. Belonging in these spaces is conditional. It depends on how well I fit the existing structure, how seamlessly I align with expectations, how little friction I create. And over time, I learn to comply. I learn how to be agreeable without disappearing completely, how to be distinct without unsettling the balance, how to exist within a narrow band of acceptability. This is not oppression in the dramatic sense. It's something subtler. It's adaptation. And adaptation, when prolonged, can feel like erasure. I've also felt this displacement socially, in friend groups that formed around shared seasons that have since passed, around identities that no longer reflect who I am, around values that once felt aligned but now feel distant. I watch conversations unfold that no longer include me in any meaningful way. Not because I've been excluded, but because I've outgrown the script. The jokes no longer land. The priorities feel foreign. The rhythm feels off. And I don't know how to say that without sounding ungrateful. So I smile. I nod. I participate just enough. And afterward, I go home with a quiet ache that has no obvious cause. This is the loneliness of women who don't belong anywhere, not because there is nowhere to go, but because staying feels increasingly dishonest. What makes this loneliness particularly difficult is that it often appears during a phase of life when women are expected to have settled, to have found their people, their place, their rhythm. There is an unspoken assumption that by midlife, questions of belonging should be resolved. That uncertainty should have given way to stability. That restlessness is something young people experience, not something that resurfaces after years of building a life. So when I feel this way, I question myself. Why now? Why this dissatisfaction? Why this sense of not fitting when nothing has gone terribly wrong? I look around and see others who seem content occupying their roles, who appear rooted, anchored, certain, and I wonder if something inside me failed to solidify the way it was supposed to. But the truth is more complicated than personal failure. Belonging isn't static. It isn't something you secure once and then keep forever. It shifts as we change, and women change profoundly in the middle of life in ways that aren't always visible or socially accommodated. Our values refine. Our tolerance for pretense diminishes. Our capacity for surface-level connection wears thin. We begin to crave environments that can hold complexity instead of suppressing it. And when those environments aren't available, loneliness appears not as despair, but as misalignment. I've stayed in places longer than I should have, because leaving felt selfish, because departure felt like disruption, because I didn't have a clear alternative to move toward. There is a particular fear that arises when you don't belong, but also don't know where you would belong instead. The fear of floating, of becoming untethered, of losing even the imperfect sense of place you currently have. So many women endure this quiet exile. They remain in social circles that no longer nourish them, in family dynamics that no longer recognize them, in communities that feel safe but not alive. From the outside, it looks like loyalty. From the inside, it feels like slow suffocation. What makes this loneliness even more complex is that it's often accompanied by responsibility. Children, aging parents, careers, commitments that make mobility emotional or physical feel impossible. Leaving isn't just about desire, it's about consequence. So instead, many women shrink. They take up less emotional space. They compartmentalize. They reserve their truest thoughts for private moments if they allow themselves to have them at all. Loneliness grows in the gap between who you are and where you're allowed to be that person. And yet, there is something quietly instructive about this discomfort. Loneliness, in this context, is not a punishment. It's a signal that the shape of your life has changed, even if the structures around you haven't. A signal that the environments you once fit into no longer accommodate the person you've become. It's tempting to interpret this as personal failure, to assume the problem is restlessness, ingratitude, or an inability to settle. But what if it's something else? What if this sense of not belonging is not an indication that something is wrong with you, but that something in your environment is outdated? What if loneliness is pointing you toward a truth you haven't yet articulated? I'm not suggesting dramatic exits or radical reinventions. That language doesn't honor the reality of women who carry responsibility. This isn't about abandoning everything. It's about recognizing when staying costs too much. I've begun to understand that belonging isn't about familiarity. It's about resonance, about being in spaces where my presence doesn't require translation, where my thoughts don't need to be simplified, where my questions don't feel inconvenient. Those spaces may be fewer. They may be harder to find. They may require patience and discernment. But staying where I don't belong simply because it's familiar creates a loneliness that compounds over time. There is grief in acknowledging this. Grief for the places that once felt like home. Grief for relationships that no longer align. Grief for versions of myself that thrived in environments I can no longer inhabit. But grief, at least, is honest. Loneliness without acknowledgement turns into resignation. I don't want to resign myself to a life that looks stable but feels hollow. I don't want to keep calling places home just because I've been there a long time. Belonging, I'm learning, isn't about how long you stay. It's about whether you can arrive fully as you are now. And if you can't, if you feel like a visitor in every room, if you sense yourself editing, shrinking, or bracing, no matter where you go, that loneliness is trying to tell you something. Not that you are difficult, not that you are ungrateful, but that you are changing. And change, when it outpaces its surroundings, feels exactly like not belonging anywhere. That feeling is frightening. It strips away certainty. It leaves you standing between what was and what hasn't yet appeared. But it is also a threshold, a quiet, unstable place where honesty begins. And for many women, it is the first truthful place they've stood in years. You're not broken. You're in the middle. I want to begin this ending by removing a word that has been quietly shaping how I see myself for years. Broken. I've used it internally more times than I can count. Not dramatically, not out loud, but subtly, almost academically, as a way to explain the discomfort I couldn't categorize. As a shortcut when I didn't have language for the distance I felt between who I was supposed to be and who I actually was becoming. Something must be wrong with me, I thought. Something must not have developed correctly. Something must have stalled. It took me a long time to understand that what I was experiencing wasn't damage. It was transition, and transitions, especially the quiet ones, are almost never respected in a culture that prefers outcomes. The middle is an uncomfortable place to live. It doesn't offer the clarity of beginnings or the reassurance of endings. It doesn't come with applause. It doesn't come with titles. It doesn't even come with certainty that it's leading somewhere better. The middle simply exists as a state of becoming messy, unresolved, undefined. And women are rarely given permission to stay there. We are expected to know who we are, to be settled, to be coherent, to have arrived at some stable version of selfhood by now. There is an unspoken deadline attached to our lives, after which ambiguity is seen as failure. So when I found myself questioning things, I thought I'd already decided my rhythms, my relationships, my desires. I interpreted that questioning as regression. I thought I was falling apart. But falling apart implies collapse. What I was experiencing felt different, slower, more internal, like a structure being quietly dismantled from the inside because it no longer matched the person living within it. The middle doesn't feel heroic. It feels disorienting. I wake up some days unsure of what I want, not in a catastrophic way, but in a way that unsettles the narratives I once relied on. The roles that once fit comfortably now feel slightly misaligned. The answers I used to give automatically now require pauses. Those pauses used to scare me. I thought certainty was the goal. I thought knowing was strength. I thought ambiguity meant weakness. But certainty, I've learned, can also be a form of emotional rigidity. It can be the result of settling too early, of stopping the conversation with yourself because it's easier than continuing it. The middle is where that conversation resumes. And yes, it's lonely. Not because I am alone, but because the middle isn't widely inhabited. There aren't many scripts for it. There aren't many public narratives that honor it. So when I'm here, I feel like I'm wandering without witnesses. But that doesn't mean I'm lost. It means I'm between identities. I'm no longer the woman who believed endurance was the same as fulfillment. I'm no longer willing to mistake functioning for meaning. I'm no longer satisfied with relationships that don't allow me to be fully present as myself. And I'm not yet the woman who knows exactly how to live from this new awareness. That space between what no longer fits and what hasn't yet formed is the middle. And it's not brokenness. It's honesty. I think part of what makes this stage so painful is that it asks me to grieve without offering immediate replacement, to let go of old frameworks without promising new ones right away, to sit with questions instead of rushing toward answers that feel safer. Grief doesn't always announce itself as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as restlessness, as irritability, as fatigue, as loneliness. Sometimes it shows up as the quiet realization that the life I built with good intentions no longer reflects my inner reality. That realization doesn't mean the life was wrong. It means I've changed. And change, especially in the middle of life, is rarely celebrated. It's tolerated at best, pathologized at worst. Women who change are often seen as unstable, ungrateful, difficult. We're told we should be past this, that we should know better by now, that we should be settled. But what if settling isn't the same as grounding? What if the discomfort I feel is not a flaw in my character, but a refusal of my spirit to keep living at half depth? The middle asks different questions than the beginning ever did. It doesn't ask, what do I want to be? It asks, what am I no longer willing to pretend? It doesn't ask, how do I succeed? It asks, what does alignment feel like in my body? It doesn't ask, who do others need me to be? It asks, who am I when no one is watching? These questions don't come with clear answers. They come with sensations, with instincts, with quiet internal shifts that take time to interpret. And because they don't produce immediate results, they're often dismissed. But they are the work. Loneliness in the middle is not evidence that I am failing. It is evidence that I am no longer numbing myself to misalignment, that I am paying attention, that I am refusing to live on autopilot. The middle strips away distractions. It removes the urgency of proving myself. It asks me to notice what actually nourishes me instead of what merely fills time. And yes, it can feel empty. But emptiness is not absence. It's space. Space where something truer can eventually emerge. I've noticed that when I stop trying to fix my loneliness, it begins to soften. Not disappear, but change texture. It becomes less accusatory, less sharp, more like information than indictment. It tells me when I'm out of alignment, when I'm staying silent to preserve harmony, when I'm shrinking to stay connected, when I'm choosing familiarity over honesty. Loneliness, in this sense, becomes a compass, not one that points me toward easy solutions, but one that orients me toward integrity. The middle doesn't ask me to become better. It asks me to become more real, and that is a much harder request. It means letting go of the image of myself as someone who has it together. It means admitting that I don't have a clear map forward. It means allowing myself to be seen as unfinished, not because I want sympathy, but because it's true. There is relief in that truth. I don't have to justify my confusion. I don't have to explain my longing. I don't have to package my experience into something inspirational. I can simply be here. And here is not nothing. Here is where discernment sharpens, where tolerance for superficiality fades, where the need for depth becomes non-negotiable, where relationships are evaluated not by longevity or appearance, but by resonance. Here is where I learn that peace is not the absence of tension, but the absence of pretense. I am no longer interested in being admired for my strength, if that strength requires self-erasure. I am no longer interested in stability that costs me my inner life. I am no longer interested in belonging that demands I fragment myself to fit. The middle has taught me that loneliness is often the price of refusing to abandon myself. And that price, while painful, is not meaningless. It signals a boundary being formed, a value clarifying, a truth coming into focus. I don't know exactly where this path leads. I don't have a neat ending. I don't have a resolution that ties everything together. What I have is a quieter confidence. Not confidence in outcomes, but in my capacity to stay present with uncertainty, to listen to what feels true even when it disrupts the narrative I've been living inside. That may not look impressive from the outside, but it feels honest. And honesty, I'm learning, is a form of belonging. Belonging to myself first. So if you are here, if you recognize yourself in this space of ambiguity, if you feel the ache of loneliness without a clear cause, if your life looks fine but something inside you feels unfinished, I want to say this plainly. You are not broken. You are not late. You are not failing. You are in the middle, and the middle is not a mistake. It is where depth begins. I want to end this story the way it actually lived, without fireworks, without a dramatic turn, without pretending that everything suddenly made sense. Because my story was never about collapse. It was about accumulation. It was about years of being capable, years of being reliable, years of showing up, adjusting, carrying, translating myself into forms that fit the room I was in. It was about learning how to live a life that looked whole while quietly feeling detached from it. About functioning so well that no one thought to ask whether I felt connected, nourished, or known. I didn't lose myself all at once. I misplaced myself slowly, in the spaces between conversations, in the habits of saying, "I'm fine," in relationships that were polite but shallow, in environments that valued my output more than my presence. Loneliness in my life was not the absence of people. It was the absence of resonance. It was the cost of being adaptable for too long without checking whether what I was adapting to still matched who I was becoming. I confused aloneness with loneliness and ran from silence when silence was actually the only place I could hear myself again. I mistook independence for wholeness and wondered why achievement didn't quiet the ache. I believed that if I just tried harder, connected more, worked better, managed myself more efficiently, the emptiness would resolve on its own. It didn't, because the problem was never effort. The problem was misalignment. What this story revealed to me slowly, uncomfortably, is that loneliness can be a form of honesty, not a punishment, not a failure, but a signal that something essential has been left unattended, that my inner life has grown larger than the containers I was living in, that the woman I am now requires a different pace, a different depth, a different kind of connection than the one I accepted before. The most painful realization wasn't that I felt lonely. It was that I had normalized it. I had told myself that this was adulthood, that this was maturity, that wanting more depth was indulgent, that feeling out of place meant I should be grateful for what I had instead of listening to what I needed. But gratitude and honesty are not opposites, and stability is not the same as belonging. The lesson this story leaves behind is not a set of steps or strategies. It's something quieter and much harder to live by. Loneliness does not mean something is wrong with you. It often means something true is trying to surface. It means you've outgrown certain roles, certain conversations, certain environments. It means your tolerance for surface-level living has worn thin. It means your inner life is asking for more space than it's been given. Applying this lesson doesn't require a dramatic overhaul of your life. It doesn't ask you to leave everything behind or reinvent yourself overnight. It asks for something more subtle and more radical. To stop gaslighting yourself out of your own experience. To stop calling misalignment a personal flaw. To stop treating emotional numbness as the price of being together. It asks you to listen to the discomfort, to the restlessness, to the quiet sense of not fitting, and to treat those signals as information rather than problems to solve away. In practical terms, this might look like noticing where you consistently feel smaller, quieter, more guarded, and questioning why. It might mean allowing pauses instead of rushing to certainty. It might mean choosing fewer connections, but deeper ones. Or giving yourself permission to be unfinished without apologizing for it. Not to fix your loneliness, but to understand it. Because understanding changes how loneliness lives inside you. It becomes less accusatory, less isolating, more like a companion pointing toward truth rather than an enemy to defeat. And this is where I want to leave you, not with resolution, but with recognition. If you followed this story and felt something stir, if parts of it sounded uncomfortably familiar, if you recognized yourself not in the drama but in the quiet spaces between it all, then hear this clearly. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Before we close, I want to ask you a small question, one that doesn't have a right or wrong answer, only honesty. Question: when you think about your own loneliness right now, which feels closer to the truth? I feel lonely because I don't have enough people or connection in my life. B: I feel lonely because the connections I have don't reflect who I am anymore. Comment A or B below. Just the letter is enough. And if you feel comfortable, share a little more in the comments. What does loneliness look like in your life right now? Does it feel like absence or misalignment? Does it feel loud or quietly constant? Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to read tonight. If this kind of conversation resonates with you, if you're not looking for motivation, but for understanding, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows this space to keep telling stories that don't rush toward answers, but stay with the truth long enough for it to matter. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, you're not broken. You're just in the middle.